This is Duke University.
Is data without impact when evidence and politics collide, I believe was what came after the colon on that. And our moderator today is, we're very, very happy to have with us Leoneda Inge, who those of you who listen to WUNC, National Public Radio affiliate here, you've heard her voice and now you get to see her face. So she's been great to help us out. And Leoneda has been with WUNC since 2001 and has covered lots and lots of things. I have her bio here, but in the interest of not embarrassing her with her whole list of awards and accomplishments, I'll just say she's won a lot of awards, and she's now their changing economy reporter at WUNC. So thanks so much to her, and she's going to take over from here and introduce our two guests, Cook and Billy Pizer.
Hi there. Sometimes when I heard about this particular forum, I thought, wow, I thought my job was hard, but it's much easier than their job, I think. I think with what these two men do, if they could get their information to journalists in a way that we understand it, it's good to go, right? Would we not think that it's good to go? That especially if there's a little controversy there, and I think definitely climate change and gun control has so many layers of controversy. That's why we're here today. We know what the numbers are, but still we just can't make people believe it. But the gentlemen that are here today, there aren't many people who have researched gun violence in the United States as thoroughly as this gentleman, Professor Philip Cook. He's an economist who is a professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy. And actually, he has a book coming out really soon with a colleague, Kristen Goss. It's The Gun Debate, What Everyone Needs to Know. Quite timely, I would say. And right next to him, one thing I learned about this gentleman, Professor Billy Pizer, is that you're a graduate of the right down the street.
I am.
Of the,
Full circle.
Yes, of the North Carolina School of Science and Math. Did I say it right? Yeah, School of Science and Math. I should know that school because I've been trying to get my boys in there for a long time. I think everyone in Durham and Raleigh and Chattanooga is in there. So I know they've invited you back to speak several times. And one thing that you're a professor also in the Sanford School of Public Policy, but one thing that's very interesting and I think impressive is that you are a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Environment and Policy in the U.S. Treasury Department. So in a way, you've seen both sides of the research on one end, and then let's see how can we convince policymakers to, as they say, take it on down the field. And hopefully they do that at times, and sometimes they don't. Well, first of all, I'd like these two gentlemen they're going to make brief remarks, and before we get our conversation going. So we'll begin with Professor Phil Cook.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. I have been at this a long time. In fact, a friend of mine recently asked me to reflect on my research in the gun violence area, and I realized that this was really a sort of a memoir of part of my research life that I ended up calling the Great American Gun War, Notes from 4 Decades in the Trenches. And I think it does have that quality. And the war is actually being fought primarily by advocates and advocacy organizations such as the National Rifle Association and the Brave Campaign and so forth. But inevitably, us researchers are recruited, and it's very hard to stay clear of it in terms of setting the agenda and in terms of how the results are used and so forth. My findings over the years have covered most of the topics that are being debated and have been debated, but have probably the force of providing the foundation for a pro-control position. example, has found that the type of weapon used in an attack matters, that guns are intrinsically much more lethal than other common weapons that are used and much more likely to kill. So we care about what kinds of weapons are being used in robberies and assaults and all of the rest of it. And in that way, it's an important public health issue. It's an important criminal issue. And the other foundational issue is the finding that the general availability of guns makes a big difference in terms of how likely a gun is going to be chosen by a criminal. So in areas which have lots of guns, then the robberies are committed with guns. And in areas where they are relatively few in the U.S., then they are committed with knives or clubs to a greater extent. So putting those two together then is the beginning of saying, well, it makes sense then to begin a discussion about regulating gun transactions or possession or use. It's not been consistently so. Some of my research has gone in the other direction, but that is, and certainly, and I think this is important to our conversation, it's not been my purpose in my research to provide support for one side or another. That is pretty much just the way it turned out. So given that the way it turned out ends up, by and large, being supportive and helpful to the pro-control side of the argument, then I guess it's fair to say that in terms of my influence, it's either been zero or negative over the last few decades. If we do a very quick history of gun control during that time, the first thing is to notice that most states during that time have deregulated gun use to a large extent. And it's much easier to get a permit to carry a concealed gun, or in 5 states there's no requirement of any kind. The states have preempted city regulation, where a lot of the regulation has gone on, and in other ways have gone with this kind of NRA deregulation campaign. And the federal government has not been helpful in this area. The second thing to notice is that in 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in on this with the Heller decision, and for the first time in 2 centuries discovered that there was a personal right to keep and bear arms based on the Second Amendment, something that no previous court had noticed. And it was, of course, a 5-4 decision, and it's very limited in the way it's written, but there it is, and that has made certainly a big difference in a variety of ways in how people are talking about it and what's going on. And the third trend that I think is relevant and related is that public opinion over the last 2 decades has swung against gun control. So if you look 20 years ago, there was very broad, large majority support for strong gun control. Now it's more balanced, kind of 50-50, and it's become much more polarized in terms of party lineups. So at least in those areas, as I say, my research has been on the losing side, by and large. So it doesn't speak well of my influence and the influence of people that like me. All right. So let me just say that often scientists complain, including social scientists, that their research is ignored. And especially ignored by policymakers who seem often content to proceed intuitively or ideologically without paying any attention to the data that brings us. That's not true in the gun debate. In fact, research has played a very important role along the way, despite the fact that it is super ideological. So the pro-gun people have relied very heavily on 2 social scientists, Gary Fleck and John Locke, and we can talk about that more later. But also the National Rifle Association took research so seriously that it had its friends in Congress squash research funding in the Centers for Disease Control, because the findings that were coming out of that were that having a gun in the home is risky and dangerous. The NRA didn't like that, so it had funding withdrawn from that research program. And so it wasn't that the NRA or the pro-gun advocates ignore research, quite the contrary. In fact, they have always been my best readers. I can count on them reading everything I write. And so finally, just to set this up, is we have a situation like it's true certainly in climate change and a variety of other ways, where it's not true that 100% of the scientists agree. It's not just that we have the science on one side and the politicians on the other. In fact, within the science community, we have a division. It's probably more evenly split than is true with climate change, but in any case, it is there. And that's often true in science. It's not true that science produces the truth and then it's just a matter of selling it to the decision makers. It rather is that there's a process often very contentious within the scientific community. And the question is, how is that going to be resolved? We would like it to get resolved internally through a process of replication, through give and take in the scientific community, and then eventually the hope is the truth will come out. In the gun area, it's being refereed not by the scientists, but by the advocates. And that has been a real problem. It is the judgment about what's the best science is then being argued by those who stand most to gain by particular findings, rather than who is doing the most reliable work in this area, or the opinion of other scientists. All right, so that's enough for now.
So, Professor Pizer, I keep trying to make you rich.
I know. You're trying to get the drug company, but.
But maybe you could tell us a little bit more about when he talks about scientists and advocates, who has the power, when we think of climate change.
I think it's, there are a lot of similarities as Phil was talking. I was thinking about the fact that, climate change is certainly characterized by a polarized ideological set of views. Like Phil, I don't really think of myself as focusing as much on supporting one side or the other. Most of what I've tried to do over my research career has been to say, if you're trying to do something about the problem of climate change, what are some different options, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of those options? And it's interesting. I was thinking of when you introduced me and you said, "Oh, he's been at the Treasury Department." It occurred to me that the two examples of things research I've done that I feel like has actually turned into policy or has informed policy are both examples that are completely outside of the time I spent in government. One is an example of a mechanism that was used in California when they designed their emission trading program. Another is the way that the United Kingdom and France both measure the consequences of climate change. But all the time I spent in government, I didn't actually accomplish anything. Not in the way that I had hoped. Which we could have a conversation about, why that happened. But I do think there. So my research has not been as focused on the evidence about climate change. But I thought what I thought would be interesting is kind of give you an example of how I've seen research work its way into the debate, I think in fairly constructive ways, and maybe that could be a jumping off point for the conversation. I did research really kind of springing out of my dissertation, believe it or not, 20 years ago, that looked at the advantages of regulating with a price mechanism as opposed to a quantity mechanism. What do I mean? I could tell people to spend a certain amount of money to try to reduce their emissions, but I wouldn't know how much they would actually reduce. Or I could tell people reduce a certain amount, but I wouldn't be sure exactly how much it was going to cost. And in the research I did and the models I used, I basically argued that if we were going to do something, we should probably use a price or a cost-based approach. It just made more sense given the structure, the long-term nature of the problem. And this went absolutely nowhere. I mean, the kind of way it was framed is, well, we ought to tax pollution or tax carbon dioxide emissions, rather than set up an emissions trading program, which was kind of the main vehicle during the 90s and the 2000s to try to tackle the problem. So the idea of proposing a tax, really only appealed to a couple of economists out there. But what happened was, in the political debate, as people were trying to come up with ways of designing these emission trading programs, not surprisingly, there were constituents who wanted to do something about climate change, but were very concerned about the risk of very expensive costs, businesses, for example.
Like me driving a Chevy Tahoe here that cost me so much in gas, and I didn't get a chance to drive my Chevy Volt because it's still a dealership. You know, I just cannot afford to have that Chevy Volt.
Yeah, so exactly. So, should you be forced to pay a lot more for your Chevy Volt, or should we be looking for cheaper reductions somewhere else outside of your Tahoe versus your Volt? But the interesting thing to me is that ultimately these ideas work their way into the debate, but not in the way that I had framed them. I mean, I had framed it as you were concerned, what's the optimal, what's the best thing to do? And what ultimately happened was people were concerned about an issue, and by kind of recasting what I had suggested in a way that appealed to those people, so that you wouldn't be forced to drive a Chevy Volt. You might be forced to pay a certain amount more to drive your Tahoe, but then you could choose whether or not it was worth it to drive your Volt or not. That sort of thinking that kind of tried to limit how much people would spend was appealing to a lot more constituencies. And it's that kind of mechanism that I think ultimately worked its way. That's what actually worked its way into the California system, was some sort of a cap on how much people could spend. But it was reformatting the idea in a way that the political process could actually use, which turned out to be very important. Just to kind of finish my brief opening remarks, I mean, I almost think of myself more as an engineer than a researcher in the problem, in the sense that I'm not really trying to, create evidence that climate change is a problem or that it's not a problem. I'm just trying to help people figure out the ways they can solve it in the best way, the best way possible. Now, we can talk about why the evidence of climate change has been so hard to convince people, and if you want, I can say something about that, but my own focus has really been on the, how do we deal with it if we're going to.
It makes me think that if anything is voluntary, whether it's to turn in your guns, the old gun buyback programs they used to have on Saturdays all across the country. Turn in your gun and, I don't know, did you get money? Or you got something possibly, or voluntarily.
Reduce your emissions.
It almost makes me think that those will probably never work. And that's why politicians can't ignore the numbers, because their constituencies, sometimes you wonder, do they really care? I would like to think that I care. But now I'm at the point where I think, we need to just pick a generation of children. This particular year, the children that are born in 2021 or 2017, for example, they wouldn't be my children. But children that are born at that point, that they only have 2 light bulbs in their home. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they have to walk so far before you're able to drive. It's just like the rules of the day. It's like it's going to have to be something probably so strict and mandatory, because the way that we've been doing it for so long will always bring such debate. Because you're not made to do anything, really.
Well, we may ultimately get there. I think the thing that really makes climate change hard, and this is a bit different than gun control, is the consequences are just much less palpable. You can talk about storms, and you can talk about rising sea levels, but these aren't things we're experiencing right now. These are things that they're saying they're going to get worse, and they're saying they're going to happen. And honestly, by the time you actually believe that it's because of climate change, it's too late. You're kind of stuck with it. Climate change is one of these phenomena that it's the accumulation of everything we've done in the past that's causing the problem. So if we wait to actually see the consequences, we're done. We're living, well, we could do some geoengineering or some really weird stuff, but we're basically stuck with the consequences. And that is a little bit of a difference with the gun control, where we're seeing it right now, as it emerges.
And then we're shocked when something, just extraordinarily bad happens, and then you say, once that shock is over, things kind of go back to normal, don't they?
Yeah, of course, the most visible bad thing was the Newtown massacre of little school children, which has actually eventually gotten the public's attention, and with some presidential leadership has had a more sustained effect on the conversation than we've had for all the other massacres that we've had in recent years. So that is, I think, been an unusual circumstance, and there is some organization that has occurred as a result of that event and the leadership that we've had in that event. But I mean, on the question of, about data and evidence, it is unfortunately true that we're all inclined to believe what is convenient to believe. And so that whenever there is a credible source of what we might see as a credible source that is offering us a convenient result or convenient piece of data, then the inclination is to say, yeah, I'll choose to believe that, and forget about all of the counter evidence that might be occurring. And I would say, again, that the pro-gun group has been brilliant in this area of persuading gun owners and gun lovers that they are not only have a fun hobby with their guns, but that they're also protecting their neighborhoods, that they're resisting tyranny, that they in fact are a righteous group of people whose hobby turns out to be our first best defense against government crackdown and the invasion by the United Nations forces and all these other ideas that are out there. And of course, if you like your guns, and we have 20 of them or something, this is such a wonderful story, because you can say not only am I having fun, but also a defender of freedom. And it's very hard to get past that convenience factor. On the climate change, yeah, I mean, it is very inconvenient to believe that we all should cut our standard of living in certain respects in order to take care of 2 generations from now. And that's.
There's a drought in California right now, and they're like asking people to turn off their lights, pretty much. I mean, it's gotten to that point. I mean, today, Yeah. But then again, I guess when we're on the computer reading the news, we just skip over that really quick. So, glad I'm not living in California right now.
Well, that's also why I think a lot of there's been a shift. I think the economists would come in the room and say, well, you got to do something that finds the way to reduce emissions as cheaply as possible. Well, it turns out the things that are cheapest are for us to change our behavior, which we don't really want to do. The more expensive things to do are to create elaborate machineries that can deliver exactly the same services, but don't emit any carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. And I think one of the things we've learned is that we're going to probably, if we really want to deal with the problem, we have to lean on something that doesn't make consumers change their behavior as much, because even if it's more expensive, in total, it doesn't make them give up their Tahoe. They can still have a Tahoe, which is runs on a big battery.
One of my, speaking of climate change and safety and conservation, one of my favorite stories, I guess of the past couple of years, was actually in Tokyo, when there was a decision that was made to really change culture, work culture, and convince men especially to wear short sleeve shirts to work, because the air conditioner was not going to be at that level anymore. It was because they needed to cut that and decrease that, and how hard it was really to get that across. I said, well, how come they're not doing that here by now? Just like, this is what the thermostat is going to say. So, but allowing them that's still considered professional wear.
I think Jimmy Carter tried that. Didn't he try to get everybody to wear sweaters to save energy during the 70s?
Yeah, I recall that. Yeah.
I'm asking you.
Yeah.
Went over really well.
Professor Cook, were you surprised in the past year in North Carolina, that there's is it Ruger is opening up a plant here? A gun manufacturing plant. North Carolina is known to make your socks and underwear. But there were no gun manufacturing plants here. We manufacture just about everything else, furniture. But and now I don't know if Beretta is still looking to move here now. because now, you know, I guess Ruger's here. They're like, well, they're quite friendly in North Carolina.
I mean, of course, the first answer again as an economist would be to say this is where they
It's
can
500
get
jobs.
unemployed skilled
Yeah.
labor and
It's 500.
from all of the cutbacks in mill jobs. But I mean, the other part of it is the gun industry has been sensitive to state politics, and the politics of the state have shifted very much pro-gun. So that may be playing some kind of role.
Well, I haven't been using my iPhone appropriately, but maybe there's some other questions in the audience that someone would like to ask one of these kind gentlemen.
I wanted to ask something that I think both of you can speak to about sort of ordinary people's understanding of statistics and how use of statistics can befuddle or can support or undercut. I find that I don't understand them well enough, and I read quite a bit of them as science in journalism, like such and such percentage or have this number of, and I don't find that they translate. How motivating do you think those are to behavior change, or how relevant do you think it is to include those kinds of more sort of scientific facts in your research and also in the journalism that is put forward to the American public on these issues?
I guess my reaction is that, you know, I think for public consumption, it probably doesn't work at all. I mean, I think what Phil was saying about, you know, the narrative that you're able to construct around various facts, you know, is much more compelling than the statistics. I mean, I think, what is true is most decision makers have staffs that are pretty sophisticated and often want to understand what exactly is going on, and the best ones are trying to make their decisions based on that information. So I think there's certainly a role for all that stuff in the public discourse. Stakeholders are also very educated and want to understand all of those details. So I don't think you can ignore those details in your research, but I think you have to be practical about, the communication to broader audiences. It just, I don't know what Phil thinks, but I found it very hard to communicate effectively those sorts of things.
It was an interesting experience. One thing that we and other academics know is that once you publish your results, they're out there for anyone to dispose of as they see fit. And in some cases, it's quite abusive. But I had the kind of 40% experience following the Newtown massacre, so that President Obama and the Vice President and others started saying, in connection with the idea of universal background checks, that 40% of all of the sales of guns in this country did not require a background check. And that was repeated, and it was challenged by the other side, and it went back and forth. And there's a couple reactions. First of all, that's my number, all right? And so they didn't say so, but it's been footnoted, but it was my number, and I ended up writing an op-ed with my co-author that said, this number's 20 years out of date. It misrepresents what we said, which was not sales but transactions of all kinds, half of which were gifts. And what's more, it's not relevant. What we want to know is how criminals get guns, not how guns change hands. And it could be that the administration's people knew that, but it seemed useful to them rhetorically. I mean, it is a rhetorical exercise, but it was useful to sound scientific. And the numbers, having a number, made it sound like it was a better informed opinion than if they said lots of guns change hands, or whatever the deal.
Right, it does add legitimacy, certainly.
I think it does create a kind of legitimacy, and there is a quest to, and if there isn't a number available, sometimes politicians have been known simply to make it up. Like in the gun area, there was a number that was circulated for decades, which was there are 20,000 gun laws in this nation. And when we tried to track that down for the book that we wrote, Kristen Goss and I, it turned out it was just made up originally. That it was based on nothing at all. But then once it was said, it said, oh boy, this sounds like a great number to use in all kinds of arguments. And then it became part of the rhetoric around, we don't need more gun control, we need to enforce existing gun control. So it's kind of the pseudo-science of false precision.
I saw a number. So is it true that 30,000 gun deaths in the U.S. a year?
That is true, yes. Yeah, very sadly.
30,000 gun deaths. And I don't know if that's high, or is that, is it lower than it used to be? Or is it getting worse? And then I think a lot of the big use, there's suicides, aren't they?
19,000 are suicides, and so it's well more than half of the gun deaths in this country are suicide. And the homicide picture, it makes up most of the rest. There are some fatal accidents, of course, and some that are just unclassified. But the 11,000 or so gun homicides is actually substantially lower than the peak, which occurred in the early 1990s. So what we've experienced this extraordinary change in public safety over the last 2 decades. It's simply become a much safer country against all kinds of crime, including homicide.
I won't say what the author of Freakonomics says about that. I mean, I think he goes in crazy detail of just don't have as many criminals because they just weren't born.
Yeah, I mean, there are various arguments, starting with Roe v. Wade and going on to taking the lead out of gasoline is another favorite.
Yeah.
And not crazy, but also not correct by my research. That's a different thing.
Any more questions? Because Wade, the gentleman in the back.
Yeah, so as a researcher, you have data that indicates a particular conclusion, and you want to advocate for that conclusion, or you believe that there's a particular course of action that is clearly indicated. Do you act as an advocate for that explicitly, or is it better to try to maintain the sense of, I'm just showing you the data, it's up to somebody else to be an advocate, whether that's a lobbying group or someone else has a different way of presenting it? I guess what I'm asking is, what do you think is more effective, trying to maintain the position that as a researcher you don't have a particular dog in the fight, you just want to get the data and make sure that someone else can draw the correct conclusion, or do you think it's better to get out there and say, you ought to do this, we ought to make these changes?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that. I'm sure Billy can. I think my comparative advantage is getting it out there, not in selling it. And so my hope is that I get it out there in a way that is correctly interpreted and try to, if I can, manage the interpretation to some extent. But there is a prior issue, which is, do you really put out there whatever happens to show up when you do the research, or regardless of who it's going to benefit and who it isn't? And again, in this intensely ideological atmosphere, that becomes a very tough situation. For example, I did the first big evaluation of the Brady Act that was enacted after years and years of effort under the first Clinton administration. And I found that it had no effect on homicide. And so, I mean, there was a dilemma about that. Should that be put out there for people to make what they would? And I decided that the answer is yes. That this is an important part of the discussion to have that result. And then I did the best I could in working with the reporters and that kind of thing to say what is that.
Yeah, I guess I feel somewhat the same way as Phil. I mean, I feel like, I've avoided getting involved in advocacy for or against, well, I wouldn't advocate against action on climate change, but I tended to avoid being part of the people advocating for it, partly because, and I don't know if it's as true on gun control, but there are a lot of different ways of coming at the problem, and different stakeholders want to do it differently. And my attitude is I will help anyone who is trying to think about the problem figure out a way that they can be for something that meets whatever other constraints they're operating in. I worked for many years in the Bush administration, and when I went in, I was all gung ho because my boss had told me that that he was in favor of doing some sort of emissions trading. Turns out the vice president was not, and there was a day when he told me that this was not going to happen. But I felt like the fact that I had not aligned myself too much one way or another allowed me to work with people who were coming from a lot of different places on the issue. So, like Phil, I've not held back any work even when it's been, perhaps counter to what I think would be the best thing. I will say I have held my tongue criticizing people if I thought they were, perhaps helpful, but I've never held back any of my own research.
Sure.
I mean, I think this is such an important question. I wanted, the special role that academics aspire to play is as kind of the neutral arbiter of what is factual. I think that to a remarkable degree, academia is where you can find some degree of detachment and neutrality, the willingness to go where the evidence leads you, and then tell it as it is. I've certainly found in the gun area it's very hard to get the advocates out there to accept that role when it comes to me. I mean, that they refer to me as that gun grabber cook, and worse things than that. Whereas I would say that researcher cook who is just telling you what the data show. But I think that to try to preserve, to the extent that that's possible, if we have any claim for influencing the public debate, it is because we go into it with an open mind. And if we then start becoming fierce advocates for a particular policy position, that may compromise that high standing that is very.
As a journalist, I mean, even in public radio, you think you have a lot of time until they say, you really have till 3 o'clock to do that story. I'm like, 3? You just told me at 10 this morning. So I have to try to skim reports from professors like this and get it out. But one of my favorite questions that folks like you hate, I say, I really need to get this done. Who hates you? Just ask them. And they usually catch them off guard. Like, why would she ask me who does not believe in what and they actually will tell you because they know who does not who does not like them, and they know who's refuted their work. And of course I'm going to check. But I'm like, when I get a head start, you know who does not like you and who does not, believe in your work. And I think hopefully more journalists also do that and not just take what's given to them. But I'm like, that's how I get it done. Sometimes
to follow up on one of the things that Phil said, are there ways that we can get people like the two of you in a debate? I mean, when I see these debates, there are two politicians on extreme sides and where you learn nothing. You know exactly what they're going to say, and they're not researchers. Maybe you turn into PBS at 6:00 and you get some people that are doing it. But it seems to me, is it worthwhile to try to push maybe our associations? Like I'm a psychologist, do we get APA to really push these news organizations to get our researchers out, so that the people that are listening at least are listening to this or some of the Sunday morning shows, as opposed to just who we usually hear?
I mean, I think those sorts of things are a good idea. I mean, I've been involved in some of those things in the past. Not so much like pro-climate change, anti-climate change, but issues that people were polarized within what to do, sorts of issues. And I think they have an audience. It's a different audience. I mean, it's not going to appeal to everyone. So I think you have to think about the right place. Like there's a bar association that used to sponsor a lot of these sort of debates over how to structure things, and I thought that was a venue for some of the things that I work on. But I think once you get into the popular mode, I feel like it's harder to get people to pay attention to the details. But,
Did you have a question with the orange sweater?
It was sort of a follow-up to an earlier question about misrepresentation of statistics and that sort of thing, and I guess, and it relates to this as well, whether you think when you're a researcher who works on a topic that always has been or has become controversial to the public, do you feel like there's a special responsibility to then become versed in educating people about science and about scientific processes and scientific ways of knowing? Because I'm sure there are a lot of people who would work on those topics who say, that's not what I'm doing. I'm not an educator, I'm a researcher. But how does that fit in, and then does it become your responsibility, and is there any space for that? Because I'm sure when you're dealing with a journalist or someone who's translating your work for public consumption, they don't want to hear about, what is a hypothesis and how do we test hypotheses and that sort of thing. They want to hear, about something that relates to this particular story.
Yeah, I do feel that responsibility, and in fact that's why Kristen Goss and I wrote this book, was in an effort to referee every possible debate and say, here's how you should be thinking about it. You, who's really open-minded and wants to take this on. I would say, looking at our journalists here, maybe the most difficult thing to communicate and to sell is uncertainty. And that so often everybody in the debate is sure of what the right answer is except the scientist. And so this is a very odd role for the expertise, is to say, whoa, we really don't know what the right answer is here. And yet that is intrinsic to science often, is the null hypothesis. They say nothing has been proven, it's too soon to reach a conclusion here, even though all around us are people who are absolutely sure that they know the answer. It's just boring, right? I mean,
I do have to have an answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe that's an argument for changing the way that we do journalism entirely, right? That, instead of saying we have to have an answer because of the story, say maybe the story is how we do science. I mean, maybe the story is how we should be making decision-making process, how we should be making decisions.
Yeah, and I don't know a journalist who wouldn't like to do that. I don't.
But sometimes the story is sort of, in terms of journalism, staking out reality for our culture, which is composed of many people, a frightening number of people who believe the world is 6,000 years old. Sometimes it's the use of words to even frame what the issue is, what the question is. Is it gun control or a public health issue? I'm fascinated around the evolution, because of what happened on some of the media outlets when we had the polar vortex, which is a low-pressure system. That the shift there's an attempted shift in using the words to frame the question. We're trying to move from global warming to climate change, in part because 2 weeks ago we learned that it couldn't be global warming because it's cold outside. Meanwhile, in Australia, where they're playing tennis, it's 108 degrees. So it's like journalism can frame things for people. Words are very powerful, and they conjure up images for people. And I don't know how you get the science then into the conversation at all. Because sometimes I think, I'm not sure people are interested in the science at all. Statistics, none of it matters. So how does that lead people to react the way they do to you?
Well, I think climate change is a tricky issue, partly because science only takes you so far in figuring out what you do. I mean, the science can tell you how much evidence there is about warming or extreme events or whatever it is you're particularly concerned about. Translating that into human impacts and valuing it and deciding what you then do to try to reduce risks in the future, which only has uncertainty associated with it, that's not science. I mean, it stretches the bounds of science. And so, one of the challenges, that I think people face here is this is all about, with climate change, it's all about risk management. And at least I view it that way. There's no way we're going to be sure we're not still, even everything that we did in a very ambitious policy, it's still not clear we're going to avoid some bad consequences. And so, in that world where all you're trying to do is reduce the risk of bad outcomes, there's been a tendency, to try to simplify it and say, well, what do we have to do in order to be okay, or what do we have to do in order to be safe? There's a lot of environmental regulations that are designed that way, that supposedly we're safe if we do this, and if we don't do it, we're not safe. The reality is, on most things, the more you do, the safer you are, and there's not like a bright line that says, here it's green, here it's red. And so, I'm not really answering your question, but I mean, I think the science can only go so far in answering some of these questions. Maybe in some cases they can tell you answers to particular things about, that guns are clearly causing, there are more violent outcomes when you have a gun in your hand. But, they don't tell you exactly what to do. And, that requires a lot more evaluation and other things that can be, beyond science. So sometimes I think there's a mistake in trying to characterize that as a scientific question.
You have a question?
Well, we actually have a couple questions coming in on Twitter. So Lauren Banch was asking a few questions, actually, maybe for all three of you, about how journalists cover research, right? Are certain views privileged? Or we've already started talking about this. Does the fact that one is a good story or another less so? How does the process of research getting out into journalism really work concretely? And whether, are controversies covered or are controversies avoided when you're covering it? So it's kind of a question, and from your experience, maybe working with journalists, how does that translation process actually work in practice?
As you were talking, I'm just thinking of, my experience, not to color journalists generally, has been that there is often a tendency to try to turn it into kind of a he said, she said sort of narrative. And in climate change, that boils down to some people are saying climate change is real and some people are saying it's not. And there's been some real issues with the credibility of the two sides. So that's a problem I've seen in terms of journalists covering this issue. I don't know what other people.
Yeah, I very much want to hear what our journalist has to say about this. Let me just throw in. There is one advance in journalism that I think has been very helpful, and that is kind of these fact-checking columns that with the Washington Post has St. Petersburg Times. In fact, we had one on our faculty who developed the St. Petersburg Bill and Dare along the way. So when Mike Huckabee, the former governor of Arkansas, said this crazy thing that if we remove California and Illinois and New Jersey from the picture, the U.S. is as safe from gun violence as Belgium. It's a very peculiar assertion on the face of it, and totally false. It takes 3 minutes to look up the facts on it and realize it has no relationship to the truth at all. It's just something he picked up on a blog somewhere. But sure enough, it's news because it's Mike Huckabee. And sure enough, the PolitiFact, that there was kind of some checking, and that said, oh, by the way, it's crazy. So, which has become also part of the story, and I commend the enterprise for that.
There are a whole lot of ways we cover news. I'm not sure if you know about. But I know universities and research institutions are very savvy. They have some very smart people on their campuses who do work of interest. And as soon as something happens worldwide or nationally, they say, did you know we have this person here who just researched that last year, and he published this and says this. We're like, thank you. We've been looking for that needle. And I know in the past few decades, universities have hired a lot of people that do just that, to try to know what their staff is doing so they can get information, critiqued that information, journal, information, out as soon as possible, especially when it's timely. And that's, we're on a treadmill. It just keeps going round and round and round and round, and a lot of news comes back around again, and it needs to be updated constantly. I call it the 60 minutes. You say Mike Huckabee. I like hold my microphone up, and you can say really whatever you want. I mean, if you're a liar, just say it, but it's recorded, and it will just a matter of time before it come back around and show that you're a liar. If you're willing to say it on tape, then you should be prepared for those repercussions. I mean, I call it the 60 minutes. You know how they interview someone, and then they come back with the other person and say, well, this person said that you did not do that. And then, it all spills over, and that's why it's still such a great news magazine, because they have the resources to actually, call you out. It may take a little time, but, pretty much we live in a society where you get to really say what you want at first. But now everybody's so smart, ProPublica, and they even when the president's speech, the State of the Union, it was minutes before they said these are the things that were said wrong in President Obama's speech. We've already checked it line by line.
I had a question. I wonder if I could ask you to speak a little more personally about the relationship between data and politics. Phil, you alluded to something, but I just wanted to probe a little bit. You talked about the Brady Law and a research finding that you had that you, at least for a moment, weren't sure you were going to go public with it. So I think you're suggesting it didn't coincide with what your personal political view was about the Brady Law. That may or may not be true. Have there been times when data that you have produced, found in dispassionate research, has changed your political view on either climate change or gun control? Or can any of us think of times you've changed our mind based on a piece of data?
They've kind of said they don't have a political view, that they...
Well, so maybe that's the fundamental question. Or the political view is separate from the research view.
Yeah, I think we were still citizens, and we had the right to send contributions and speak up and vote. So to some extent, I think the goal is to keep that role separate as much as possible. But the case I mentioned is the case I would put forward as the most important in my career, is that I became convinced, as against my prior in the area, that the Brady Act had been ineffective. And I thought it probably would be.
I'm trying to think of the things that have been most surprising to me. I don't think anything has ever. I don't think there's really anything that's come out that was completely against anything I was currently supportive of. There's been recent research, that actually has surprised me in perhaps the other direction, which has been about how much longer some of these greenhouse gases last in the atmosphere, which was actually surprising to me. Maybe I had a slightly more conservative view, and I'm still trying to kind of assimilate that in terms of how much more ambitious maybe I think we ought to be. I've never been personally viewing that we needed to be going way off the deep end in terms of reducing emissions, and now I'm beginning to think maybe it's worse than I thought. But so I feel like for myself, these sorts of things, they take a while to completely change my view, because one piece of evidence is only one piece of evidence, and so you need to kind of see it repeated in different places before you're really sure that there's something there.
Seems to me that one role for academics is to change the subject or suggest ways in which the current framing of issues is not constructive. And my best example of this is in climate change, and it's Bjorn Lomborg, who's a pretty high-profile guy who wrote a book called The Skeptical Environmentalist, and which I didn't take seriously for a long time until I looked at it and thought, boy, there's a lot of good information and arguments in here, and this is pretty subtle and deep. And he's got a newer book called Cool It, which I haven't finished, but the gist of it is, as I took it on a skim, is that, yeah, climate change is real, but Kyoto Accords are pretty unrealistic about the amount that you can achieve at reasonable cost. Look at all these other humanitarian things you could do to improve life expectancy and public health and so on by spending that money in a different way and getting a lot more impact. Now, he is the most high-profile person I can think who has made a kind of career out of this. And when I look at our debates on this, he doesn't show up in public at all. But it seems to me that he has a lot of credibility to me in the way, just from reading him and from the way he handles issues. And it seems to me that he is a good example of a constructive role for academics and scientists and the limitations of the impact of that. I wonder what you think of his work and of this assessment of it.
I would probably disagree a little bit in the sense that, you know, my take on his work has been that he, you know, he takes a point, which is that there are a lot of things that are probably more important for us to be worried about in a sense than climate change. I mean, Tom Schelling actually had a very good way, he's a Nobel laureate in economics, had a very good way of putting it. If you think climate change primarily affects future generations of poor people because they're the ones least able to deal with it, why aren't we doing more to help current generations of poor people? So, you know, there are a lot of ways you can kind of frame the debate to realize that climate change is not the worst problem that we're facing right now in the world. But it's kind of a false point. I mean, we're a pretty sophisticated country. You know, we have lots of people in government. They should be able to solve more than 10 problems at the same time. So, you know, the fact that climate change is not the very worst thing doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing something reasonable to deal with it. And so I feel like he's kind of made a career out of, you know, trying to turn something that really isn't as big of a story into a bigger story. So I'm not a huge Lundquist fan. I think he makes good points, but he kind of makes them more sensational than they necessarily are.
Maybe more Twitter. I mean,
This is actually from
from
me.
you.
But I guess, you know, what's fascinating, I think, is that as a kind of engineer, I think one way you describe yourself was a sense in which all of these are issues about sort of social engineering, about trying to rethink how society works. And there's a, you know, that's very unpredictable. I mean, one of the interesting things between sort of policy and, say, the humanities or other fields at the university is the question of future orientation, right? So if you're, you know, there's one thing about research on the past, the other would be advocating how we might change society in sort of substantial ways that would then change our politics of consumption and so forth, right? Which is a different kind of role, obviously. But also the only, you know, I mean, we're all sort of saying the only thing that would really change the situation would be really a kind of, some kind of deeper change, which we depend on politicians in some ways to put into effect. But if the politicians are lacking imagination, maybe the academy needs to, you know, put out visions that could be put into practice. So I don't know if that's, you know, if that nexus has ever influenced you all. That part of it's also about just imagining some different way of organizing things, but that, you know, which is not about research as much as it is about some kind of, you know, again, imagination, I guess.
Well, I do think that the political system is very short-term focused.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long-term problem like climate change, that is a really big problem, to get people to focus not just on what's happening right now, what's going to happen in a generation,
Right.
and to make people now pay for it. So, you know, I think it is a big dilemma. I'm not 100% sure exactly how academics exactly fix that. Maybe there should be more academics in politics who have a longer-term view, or maybe there's a way to try to educate people more about the need to do that. But I think it's a real problem. I don't know the solution.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's very hard to go to the root causes and know what to do about moving them or shifting them. And meanwhile, you know, people are dying in the gutter, and we gotta act within the narrower scope of what we have. But it is absolutely true what you're talking about, and I think it shows up in a surprising place in the gun debate, which is about trusting government. And a lot of the debate is that pro-gun people often will present their cases saying we can't trust government. That's why we can't have a registration system, because there's tyranny working just behind the facade that we're looking at. You can't trust the police to show up when you need them. That's why everybody has to carry their own weapon and be ready to shoot back. And why don't we trust government? I mean, it's pretty well documented the public does not trust government either in the large or in the small. And I think partly is because the politicians have found it in their short-term interest to campaign against government. And that goes back to Jimmy Carter and before, as saying the government is often part of the problem along the way. I wish there were a pro-government rhetoric that could be developed that would also be compatible with getting elected. That maybe is too tough a job, but it would be very useful.
Like during the Kennedy era, that was
absolutely.
I mean, that was like a big message. I mean, government was solving problems, and government could look to. And that's when everybody started getting into field policy.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just a generational thing to get back into it or something.
The government took us to Vietnam.
Right. So there were some errors made, probably.
Mistakes were made.
So I have a question because you're at a university, both of you, and so one of your jobs, in addition to doing your own research, is to teach students how to do research. And I'm wondering how your experience in these two areas has influenced how you teach students in terms of, storytelling. Is this something that you're teaching students is important for them to get a grasp of about how to put their work into narrative terms, or you both rely on economic tools. What other tools would you encourage students to be developing as part of their approach to similar types of questions? So how does your research affect the way you approach your teaching here at the university?
Well, actually, the first thing I was thinking about in terms of teaching students is just, you have to remain very connected to what's going on in the world, and especially if you're teaching advanced students and who are doing their PhD students. I think what's been very important to me has been to really. I lived in Washington for a long time. I cultivated a lot of relationships with people. Understanding the issues from both sides is really, really important if you want to try to change something or you want to have an influence on it. But certainly, if I was asked, I don't know that I've ever tried to build into my lectures. I've only been here for 2.5 years, so it's a little new to me. But I would certainly say, economics is a great tool. It doesn't tell you what to do. It gives you a couple of metrics that are useful and powerful, and people care about them. But there are a lot of the pieces that have to be values that have to be brought into the choices.
I think that this idea of narrative is terrifically important, and I don't think that I have been successful in incorporating it into my teaching. So I accept the premise that is how people understand things, and that it would be important for people who work in this area to develop that narrative to the extent that they can in a way that's accessible. But is it part of how we train graduate students? Probably not. For the most part, I think the emphasis is much more in getting the analysis right and then being honest about what the results show. But then how to tell the story.
We did just have this interesting conversation in our strategic planning meeting where we emphasized talking about the importance of leadership as something that we somehow needed to teach students that is broader than just the analysis and all the right answer sorts of things. And that may be a piece of this.
So I just want to give a shout out to both of you for what you're doing, because I think the way that you are engaging with public issues and not just staying in your classroom is both admirable and important. So I'm David Jarmel. I'm the head of Duke's news office. So I'm the person overseeing the release of all the research news here at Duke. And then in a previous life, I was at the National Academy of Sciences for 10 years, and so I was right in the middle of a lot of the controversies about global warming and you name it, and with all of that. And you know, as I listen to this conversation and I'm looking around the room, I'm concerned, especially among some of the younger scholars, may take away like, don't think I'm going to do that. I mean, it can seem pretty discouraging, but I mean, I'll tell you from my vantage point, just in the past few weeks, I've seen at least 2 examples come immediately to mind, and I know of others, of Duke experts who have gotten in the public arena, and I can point to tangible things that have happened from them doing that. And we have many examples like that occur here, and I'll say, I mean, I think, Phil, from your own involvement on the gun debate, I mean, clearly, it is discouraging as much as what you're saying can sound. It does make a difference, and I think about Laurent, what he's done on helping people become more aware of what's happening in Haiti, and there are many other examples. And when I was at the Academy saying this on a national level, for those of you who may go into other institutions, it really does make a difference. And it's just, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that, you know, as discouraging, say, on the gun debate, and I get plenty discouraged listening to it too. We do live in a democracy, and we have the First Amendment, and that's the kind, you know, and that's the country that we live in, and it's a big, messy, pluralistic society. But at least to me, the answer, you know, for researchers who say, I'm not, you know, is, you know, then don't turn around. You were raising evolution. Then, to my eyes, don't turn around then and start complaining. Well, you know, Americans are such idiots. They don't believe in evolution. Like, you know, we live in a country where if you know, I feel like we as citizens have some responsibility to engage. And I think that ideal is also very much in keeping with what President Broadhead and the leadership of the university talk about with knowledge and service to society. To me, this is knowledge and service to society. It can be frustrating, but if scholars here at Duke and elsewhere are not going to share what they know, then who's supposed to do it?
Thank you.
Thank you. I would also just, I hope I wouldn't convey purely a sense of frustration, although that's certainly been what I've felt at times. I mean, it's been enormously rewarding. I mean, I don't know why different people go into academia, but you know, to me, part of it was to make a difference in something, and doing research and having it sit on the shelf for me would not have been satisfying. I think for a lot of people would. And I think the challenge for a lot of people is figuring out how to do it, and providing resources so it's not hard or expensive to do these sorts of things. But I think, you know, the more the university can do, and the more, you know, we can share our experiences, you know, hopefully the more Duke can actually get, people at Duke can get out there and do more.
I know our time is probably wrapping up, but there's a lady in the back there.
Yeah, a couple of comments. In response to the question about teaching graduate students to communicate, this semester I'm actually completing a course that's geared towards PhD students and helping them become better communicators, including framing their work in part of a narrative. So there is some of that happening here. And regarding solutions and framing, some research shows that if a solution matches someone's worldview, then they're more likely to accept some of the underlying science behind climate change. But I feel like we've also seen, in terms of healthcare, market solutions related to climate change and healthcare, that a solution that originally matched with someone's worldview, then they might start rejecting it if it gets aligned with another political perspective. And I was wondering about your experiences in, if you could talk a little bit about your experiences with how people's worldviews intersect with their acceptance of solutions and their acceptance of the science. Does that make sense? Like, have you had experiences of people like beginning to accept some of the research results because of a solution that matches, or of the solution, then losing their acceptance of the solution because the science didn't match?
I mean, the thing that came to mind as you were talking about, I haven't been personally involved with, but I've kind of watched the involvement of the faith community in the issue of climate change. And I think there, you know, have been, you know, there's kind of 2 directions that people have gone. Some people have said, you know, the world is ours, you know, we dominate it, we should do whatever we want, don't worry about it. and the other has been that we are stewards and we have to take care of it. And I think that understanding that for that community, speaking in that language is very helpful. Has been a big part of the broader advocacy communities, understanding how to create a message that works for different people. I guess advocating on either side. So I certainly think it's really important figuring out how the messaging works for people coming from different places. From my own standpoint, I don't know how much I've used it myself. That's what I thought of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally in the gun area, there has been an extraordinary alignment that has emerged over the last 20 years along party lines, political party lines, which was not nearly as much present in the 1960s, for example, as it is now. And so the gun control has become a democratic thing, and pro-gun views and the anti-government rhetoric that goes with it has become a Republican. And so I think that, dissonance then produces greater alignment with people who generally think I'm a Republican then would have a very hard time in that circumstance from saying, but I support gun control. It just is not possible virtually anymore. And I don't know how to handle it in the gun area. I guess the way it's handled in climate change is to deal with immediate specific issues. I mean, the community might agree that it's on the California coast that the water levels are coming up and they better do something about it. If somebody mentions climate change, then that's going to ruin the whole collaboration because then they'll think it's Obama's idea or something. But if they can all agree that the water, for whatever reason, the water is rising, then they might be able to actually achieve some collective purpose.
And, people can be very politically practical. I mean, when they were trying to craft legislation, they brought along a lot of people who might not have, along those lines, might not care about climate change, but they have lots of generous nuclear incentives. Climate change has never been as much of a, but has never been a party issue. Generally, it's been a regional issue with states that are likely to suffer more, like Louisiana and Florida, are much more concerned about it, even though they're fairly conservative. And also, big plain states that have different interests. But I think everything has become kind of polarized over the past few years, and so there have been Republicans who've been very positive on climate change, and they've gotten voted out of office. So I don't know. I like to hope it's kind of a temporary period of polarization in the country. That's a bigger question.
So I guess our next step is to think about, I think we need to have a discussion about political polarization in science and some things like that. I mean, that's the great thing about these discussions is they open the door for thinking about future discussions. I think that's it for today. Thanks so much to you all.